Welcome, everyone. In this conversation, we revisit Professor Audrey Truschke's earlier and perhaps a most debated work, Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth. This book re examines the life of the great Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who also happens to be one of the most vilified figures in South Asian history. And Professor Truschke's work employs close readings of Persian and Sanskrit sources and reassesses the political and the moral frameworks of his age. So, welcome and thank you for your time. As we know, this is a very important era because in the popular narratives, Professor Truschke, the Aurangzeb is a villain, and often I'm sure you've seen, oh, history would have been different had he been defeated, and his brother Dara Shikoh would have won the war of succession when their father Shah Jahan was dying or was unwell. But tell me, and I guess the readers would also like to know, what drew you to Aurangzeb as a research subjects? I guess that would be the starting point.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here talking about this book that I haven't actually talked about in several years. So what drew me to him? I gave an interview in 2015. The interview was largely about Akbar. At the time, my first book was forthcoming. I was trying to drum up a little bit of interest in that book because I was a postdoctoral research, fellow. No one cared about me or my work, my comments got too many people to care. I said all this stuff about Akbar in the interview that I thought was like edgy, controversial. Still never heard from anyone about my edgy Akbar comments. But I said two sentences on Aurangzeb that I thought were unobjectionable, and I felt like the world exploded back at me. That brought home to me that we, at this point, so this is 2015, I felt that we had had several decades of advancements on scholarly work on Aurangzeb. We don't all agree about all aspects of Aurangzeb as in his reign, but we had come to scholarly consensus on some of like the big picture stuff, and none of that had been communicated to popular readers. It is not always the job of historians to convince popular readers of what historians are talking about amongst ourselves. But from time to time, somebody should try to do that. And so I thought, why not do it with Aurangzeb? So to put it briefly, I wrote about Aurangzeb because I felt that he was the most poorly understood of the first six major Mughal emperors in a popular context.
Right. And, so tell us a bit about the man from, because you look at his letters, you look at other, very, primary sources, which often escape, popular scrutiny. Well, first of all, a lot of people don't know how to read Persian anymore, or even the Sanskrit readers are not as many. What kind of a person Aurangzeb is? I mean, what we know from especially the colonial sources is that he was this cruel, bigoted man, and who basically killed his brothers and was obsessed with power and hungry for power, and changed the complexion of a secular Mughal empire. I mean, I'm summarizing the overall popular perception, especially in contemporary India. While in Pakistan, it's somewhat different because in Pakistan he's celebrated as this really pious emperor, who was true to Islamic faith, etc. So tell us about this man who then rules India for half a century up until his death in 1707.
Sure. So I think Aurangzeb has some really kind of human characteristics, right? He was really disappointed with a lot of his sons and grandsons, for example. Right? Anyone who has children can probably appreciate this feeling, right? Especially as they all grew up. I mean, he has these letters where he's just like, well, son, what are you doing? Like, like you're killing me here, right? So there's definitely aspects of him like that. There's things where parts of his letters, especially where he worries about road safety and things like that. And, he knows his tax collectors are ripping him off, but he can't do anything about it. Right. It's sort of like this like hamstrung failing politician figure. Right. I mean, I find that very humanizing.
Yes.
However, we don't care about Aurangzeb because he was some guy who lived in the 17th century. Right. We never talk about most people who lived in the 17th century. We care about him because he was a king. And as such, he was very powerful, and he had influence over the lives of 100 to 150 million Indians within his empire, right? So that's why we care about him. And I think the key thing to know about Aurangzeb is that he was a king first and foremost. Whenever he had to choose between power and anything else, any other value that he held, he chose power every single time. He chose it above his family, above his alleged piety, and all this sort of stuff. On Aurangzeb's piety, so it's hard to know, right? I mean, I would argue one can never get inside the head of a living person and figure out what they actually believe in their heart of hearts. I certainly can't do it with a guy who's been dead for over 300 years. So I don't know if Aurangzeb was really pious. I don't know if he really believed in God. What I can tell you are a couple of things. I can tell you that his piety was not sort of like traditional Orthodox Sunni piety as imagined today. Okay, so he was into talismans, he was super into Sufis, right? The man is buried at a Sufi shrine as per his own wishes, right? People forget
Yes.
all the time. So his version of Islam was not what many people think it was today. That's one thing. The other thing I can tell you about his Islam is that he used it performatively. He used it as king. That doesn't tell us whether it was genuine or not, but in a sense, personally, I can't say I care. I don't care if the guy was actually pious or not. I care how he acted as an emperor, and he definitely used Islam to great effect politically.
He used that exactly, and sadly, well, historically, kings and queens and rulers have done that, So in that way, this is not a very exceptional use of faith for political power or to maintain that. But
I agree. I would point out that Akbar used Islam politically as well, right? Akbar and Aurangzeb actually had a lot in common.
Oh, that's a really interesting. Can you elaborate this a bit more, please?
Oh, sure. So they shared a lot in common, right? I mean, they both ruled for close to 50 years, sort of beginning and end of the major parts of the Mughal Empire. They were both very successful conquerors, right? That's what distinguishes Akbar and Aurangzeb on the one hand versus Jahangir and Shah Jahan on the other, right? Is the ability to conquer land. They both knew how to run a battlefield. They were both very good at integrating new groups of people, okay, into the empire. Akbar's big success was integrating the Rajputs. Aurangzeb's was integrating the Marathas. So if you think that Aurangzeb only fought against the Marathas, you do not know your Mughal history very well, right? They both used religious traditions as political theater. A lot of similarities.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so while you studied your sources, can you also give some examples of his pragmatic governance? Because you said he kept power above everything else. Piety or faith. I mean, and of course, in so many ways to rule a big territory, a very diverse territory for almost half a century, you did need political skills as well. But often, historians have underplayed that side of Aurangzeb. They because there's this focus and emphasis and especially in the colonial period to highlight that particular division. But his pragmatic governance and keeping the empire together, and can you explain some of that, what was going on at that particular time according to your sources? You talk about road safety, for example. So
yeah. This was a big issue in general in Mughal India, was bandits on roads. And the bigger takeaway to know from that is that the Mughal kings across the board did have a paternalistic view of their duty to their subjects. So they considered it their job and their responsibility to ensure the safety of travelers on their roads, which was pretty hard by the time you get to the zenith of Aurangzeb's empire, which was about the same landmass as the current Republic of India. Okay, so not the exact same area of land, but the same general size, which is big, really big, right?
Right.
I think much about Aurangzeb's other kind of administrative duties is similar, and that was similar to earlier rulers, right? So, he did a lot of different stuff with taxes, abating taxes at various points in time, canceling taxes. Aurangzeb is, of course, much maligned for reintroducing the jizya tax, which may also have been a practical measure to sort of keep the ulama off his back, because the ulama were generally a problem for the Mughal kings. The Mughal kings were always messing with their taxes. They were always instituting, saying, okay, I'll cancel it for this year for these people, so on and so forth. I think the big pressure point for Aurangzeb in terms of administration was he expanded the empire. He adds on like a whole new quarter of the Mughal Empire. And these are areas that had not been historically integrated with North India-based rulership. So expanding the empire would have been a challenge to add all that new land regardless, but to add people who are not used to being under the yoke of Delhi, right? That's a whole nother level. And so Aurangzeb, he used sort of standard Mughal techniques, like let's take the historic leaders in this area, a lot of those people were Marathas, and let's make them Mughal mansabdars, right? Let's give them these two numbers that signify the lands that they control and the horses they have and have to bring to various battles. That caused some issues. Not everyone was crazy about the influx of Marathas into the imperial nobility, especially Rajputs, right? This is something, by the way, gets erased when you think about Hindus versus Muslims. Everyone's just like, oh, they're both Hindu. They must have been fine. But actually, the Rajputs did not consider the Marathas their equal in any possible way. Right?
Yeah.
So that's some of what he was sort of dealing with. And he held the empire together, but arguably just barely, right? It cracked up in the 30 or some years after his death.
Yes. Yes, and I'll come to that later, but I do want to talk about two most important, misconceptions or, popular views about his rule. Well, first was, of course, the temple desecrations. I mean, I won't even go into the numbers, because these days, as you know, the most active universities are located on WhatsApp groups. So, but keeping that aside, what is the evidence of his actual, orders to desecrate or destroy temples? Because I do note from I remember reading that actually he donated land or supported the building of temples as well. So it's really, that was very interesting to me. I remember, a few years ago when I read your book. So tell us a bit about that. And I'm not framing that as a communal anxiety that many Indians do, but generally in the a series of Mughal sort of continuum of Mughal empire and its governance policies in India, was Akbar really out to destroy every temple in India?
Aurangzeb, you mean?
Aurangzeb, my apologies. Yeah.
So no, he was not out to do that. Okay, so by the time Aurangzeb takes the Mughal throne, right, he, sits on the peacock throne, the idea of desecrating the temples of one's enemy, this had been around for about a millennium as a concept and a practice in South Asia, right? Now, if you're thinking back, wait a minute, were there Muslims ruling a millennium earlier? No, there weren't, right? It was quote unquote Hindu kings who came up with this idea of desecrating the temples of one's enemies. If you consider that to be enraging and inappropriate, to consider a temple as a legitimate political target, congratulations, you are a modern person. This is pre-modernity, and take it up with the Cholas, right? They're probably the biggest empire that normalized that practice. So Aurangzeb comes along. He's got this long history of people doing this to other people, and he folds right in. So when he targets temples for desecration or destruction, there's around, I think I estimate 12 to 15 times that he does this in his, nearly 90-year life. Okay, and some of those are as a prince, so not all of those are as emperor. When he does this, there is generally a proximate political reason, right? And I give some specific examples in the book. These landowners and landlords upset Aurangzeb and disobeyed Mughal policy or posed some threat, and so he destroyed their temple. There is evidence of the temple desecrations and destructions, there's more evidence for Aurangzeb's support of Hindu communities and temples through land grants, through protection orders, and this sort of thing. I know people get really upset when I say this, but folks, you're getting mad at the archive, not the messenger, right? The archive is your issue here, not me. And here's the thing, historians don't cherry pick. We don't choose one piece of evidence and ignore another. WhatsApp University, they can do that, but I cannot and would never do that. And so when we think about the question, we have to consider both pieces of evidence, right? Aurangzeb's support of temples and his destruction and desecration of temples. We have to consider them together and come up with a theory that explains both, right? And the best theory that I've come up with, and we more or less have consensus on this in the academy, so people attack me for it, but basically all Mughal historians more or less agree with me on this, is that Aurangzeb and many other people targeted some temples, not others, for political reasons, right?
Right,
Um,
right.
I want to make it clear, nobody's apologizing for this. I feel no compunction or need to apologize for anything in the past, right? It's history, right?
Yeah,
Um, I
yeah.
am trying, however, to explain it to you. And if that doesn't fit into one's modern politics, well, welcome to history.
Right. Well put, well put. Okay, the other point, which is also, by the way, very prevalent in Pakistan. I mean, of course, in India, the temples take precedence, or the attitude towards the Hindu population, the majority population of the Mughal Empire. In Pakistan, uh, the, a lot of people believe that the arts withered under Aurangzeb. That the cultural sort of how the Mughal Empire, known for its arts, architecture, innovations, they withered, and somehow emperor's personal austerity was also contributing to that. To music. So it is often said that he did not appreciate music. He banned musicians, and etc. What is the evidence on that? Uh,
Mm,
you know.
absolutely. So I acknowledge this in the book that Aurangzeb has this reputation as this kind of like austere guy, not into the finer things of life. Folks, he was the richest man alive, right? I don't know why people think he was austere. This is like completely insane, right? He wasn't like giving away like the wealth of the Mughal coffers. It is fair to say that Aurangzeb shifted patronage, and I think that's the better way to put it. So basically, he comes to power. The first 10 years of his reign are largely indistinguishable from earlier Mughal kings. He sort of like keeps things rolling on, and then 10 years into his reign, he does change a bunch of stuff. Right? He stops patronizing historians. I don't appreciate that. Makes it more difficult. Anyways, he stops patronizing historians. He reassigns musicians, so he doesn't fire them. He actually gives most of them pay raises, which is kind of weird. But anyways, he reassigns them to other stuff, and he appears going forward to not be super into patronage of like miniature artists and things like that. Right now, that none of this kills off those arts traditions. Right, those people disperse to sub-imperial courts, right, in different regions of India. There are actually more musical treatises written under Aurangzeb and during his reign, many of which are dedicated to the king, than any prior Mughal emperor. Right?
Oh
He just didn't
wow.
actually directly patronize them. In any case, so the arts were fine. Aurangzeb, however, he was interested in other things. And I think the most visceral example of this is his patronage of the Fatwa Alamgiri, which
Yes.
is a law code book. That book is still used today in some
Yes.
Islamic courts, right? I mean, if you want to say that writing a code of law that people actually use to dispense justice, that's, I don't know, somehow worthless, and like, paying a bunch of guys to paint miniature paintings that only the wealthy see, that's true art. I mean, like, that's your opinion. I think it's fairer to say that he had a somewhat different set of interests that came out in a different way. I will say on the music thing, right? So he doesn't kill off musical arts in India. He doesn't ban music or anything like that. That's all kind of invented. He does appear, however, to not want musicians playing a whole lot at the imperial court. That part appears true. That said, his final years he spent in the company of a Hindustani musician, a woman, right?
Oh,
So he arguably never quite goes away from his personal life.
right, right. That's fascinating. Now, this leads me to his preoccupations, because you see he spent almost the last 20 to 25 years in Deccan, in the south, trying to subjugate the two errant kingdoms, and he's kind of obsessed with that idea. What was this, just expansionist? Because a lot of historians have said that that was a mistake on his part, because by focusing so much on the south, he was ignoring what was happening in the north, or the seat of Mughal power. How far do you subscribe to this view of Akbar's sort of um, uh, you know misconception of how his power would expand or consolidate, and by default the Mughal rule?
So I think I'm with the consensus that
Mm.
Aurangzeb certainly lost a couple of steps towards the end, maybe more than a couple of steps, right towards the end of his life there. He wanders around the Deccan and he doesn't get much for it,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the last 5 years of the 1580s, there's a bunch of conquests. That's looking good from an imperial point of view. But after that, I mean, about 1590 to 1907, right? Like at one point, he does a 7.5 year siege of Satara fort. You can't do a 7.5 year siege. Like your siege lines are not actually, you're not besieging, right? And he should have known that. So yes, I think it was poor imperial strategy. I mean, what explains that? I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if any Mughal historian really is. I will note that Aurangzeb seemed to really like it in South India, right? He seemed to not personally want to go back to the north. Even in death, he remains in the south, right?
Yeah.
Buried in Maharashtra. This is very different, and it's a sign of how far they came from, say, Babur, his great grandfather, the first Mughal king who hated even northern India, right? He was like, it's hot, it's dusty, I can't get melons, like, this is terrible.
Yeah.
Whereas Aurangzeb, the further south he goes, I mean, for him, that appeared to have been home.
Yeah, exactly. And so his period is also by the Sikhs I mean, worldwide. They also feel that Aurangzeb's sort of very hard or harsh treatment of Guru Tegh Bahadur, who was executed, I think, in 1675, and they also, so all these different ideas. Have informed the way he's looked at. So he that was a contentious relationship, but obviously, I mean, he was an emperor. One can understand this is medieval era, and you. So talk a bit about that and how was he actually? What was all of that? A persecution of the Sikh faith or Sikh leaders, or was it more like a political project? Trying to retain and maintain power?
Mm. So, as a historian, I do not see the evidence for Aurangzeb persecuting Sikhs as a religious community. I actually think the evidence is pretty clear that
Hmm.
he went after them as a political threat, right? Now, he didn't care that they were a religious community. Like, that did nothing to save the Sikh gurus, and specifically Tegh Bahadur, from Aurangzeb's wrath, right? If you crossed Aurangzeb, or if he just thought you crossed him, like, that was sort of it for you, right? Like, once the imperial troops got their hands on you, you were toast. So, I mean, the execution is an accepted fact of history, with some small debate about where it occurred, but it definitely occurred. But the causality behind it, I do differ from the internal Sikh religious sort of narrative of that. That has upset a lot of people, right? And what I would just say, which I've said many times before, is if this is a matter of religious faith for you, don't let a historian touch it. You never
Yeah.
have to let historians debunk your religious beliefs. They are called beliefs for a reason. And just like I do not expect everybody else to be a historian, even as I might secretly harbor a wish for that, right? I do not think that it is fair or reasonable for religious communities to expect others outside of it, and especially a historian, to somehow moderate how they read the evidence in deference to religious sentiments. I simply cannot do that.
Right. So, Audrey, let's wrap up. But Aurangzeb is also his reign. With all the expansion and the consolidation of Mughal power at its peak, but it's also cited as perhaps he's accused of causing triggering the decline of Mughal Empire. Now I don't know. I mean, these assessments have been made. I remember in school and in college, when we used to read all these texts or different interpretations of Mughal history. So. How far would you agree with that assessment? I mean, were his policies spending too much time in Deccan, or maybe annoying too many groups, or appearing as this, kind of, pious, whether it was using for political reasons or not? Did that actually uh, cause the decline of Mughal Empire? I know it's a very broad question. I do understand, but I want you to dwell a bit on that. How far in your reading of both history and his era in particular, you think that's a fair assessment or not?
So, I mean, okay, I don't think you can lay the blame for the falling apart of the Mughal Empire at Aurangzeb's feet entirely, right? It's not Aurangzeb's fault that Nader Shah comes marching over from Iran in 1739, 32 years after Aurangzeb has died, and like destroys what is left of Mughal pride, demonstrating that they are an empire no more. That has nothing to do with Aurangzeb, right? And that's a really important episode in terms of the end of Mughal power. That said, I think you can point to things that Aurangzeb did that perhaps set up the Mughal state to be weaker than it needed to be. I simply don't think those are the things most popular people probably imagine, right? This had nothing to do with the temple destruction or protection stuff. It had nothing to do with his treatment of Hindus. All of that was like well within the norms of pre-modernity. I think some of the things he did, I think ironically expanding the empire probably weakened it a bit, right? I mean, it made it stronger temporarily, but also made it very unwieldy and difficult for one person to control. It's one thing. Also, not his fault, but like the guy lived a really long time, okay? Which meant that his successor, one of his sons, was already in his 60s, okay? And then after his war of succession, killing his brothers, so on and so forth, he only lived like 5 years, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't really enough time to solidify imperial rule again. Maybe if Aurangzeb had just died a little bit younger, right? It would have all been fine. I think that certainly also his treatment of some of his sons and grandsons, he basically restricted their autonomy and their ability to build up their own households. That probably wasn't great for setting them up for future success, although it did clamp down on rebellions significantly within his empire. So upside, downside.
Upside down. Well, Professor Truschke, that was so fascinating. I mean, your book is, of course, which I strongly recommend everyone who's interested in South Asia or the Mughal era must refer to that book, because some of the things that I learned through your translations or references of the original sources, I did not really know. So it's a great contribution. And of course, the very quick assessment of Aurangzeb's 50 years of rule. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for being with us. Goodbye.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.